Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the World Reconstruction Conference, if you haven't already had events in this morning. My name is Jan Kellett. I'm an advisor in the UNDP team and responsible corporately for our work on insurance and risk financing, amongst other things. And we're very happy to have you at this session today, which is on financing risk for more inclusive recovery. We have a distinguished panel here, drawn from a range of countries, and also our colleague from ILO, Pranav, that I will introduce as we go through the session. Just want to give a few, if you like, framing remarks from taking the chance as moderator to do so in terms of the session. You know, when I was planning this, I was thinking to myself, well, what's actually key here in terms of financing and recovery and inclusion all at the same time? And one of the things that came to me really was the Global Assessment Report, I think back in 2011, did quite a bit of work in and around, if you like, the uncounted natures of disasters. And how actually there's a whole slew of people and disasters which are actually off the scale and are not counted. So when we look at the figures which are ably produced by CRED, for example, each and every year, they talk about so many billions, or Munich Re and Swiss Re, if you look at those who are coming at it from the issue of the protection gap in terms of insurance. I think last year was $180 billion, for example, of loss, of which I think 90 billion was actually covered by insurance. If you look at the evidence from quite a lot of work, there's a massive amount of disasters which are uncounted, never by these statistics. And this is particularly important when we look at things, for example, like from our perspective in UNDP, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, and one of the key issues of that is leaving no one behind. So we have this sort of nexus of people who are, if you like, uncounted and in general in some ways, excluded in some ways in certain environments, that there is disasters which affect them, which are not counted, and therefore they're not included in many cases in some of the recovery programs and initiatives that we have. And that, in a sense, is what we're looking at it in terms of this session, is how we can actually do a better job when it looks at recovery and reconstruction. So two main reasons, if you like, why people are, if you like, somewhat uncounted. On the one hand, these disasters can often be small scale, often localized, don't reach media attention, and they're often repeated year on year on year as a sort of a cycle, almost like it doesn't reach much media attention anymore. Second, of course, is that the nature of these people may be in terms of being off the economic scale, financially excluded, in the informal economy, living marginally in slums, off the census, all reasons why they're not even going to be counted. And in terms of their assets are not necessarily particularly large, so they're not necessarily counted in terms of the economic values that often a country may look to look at in terms of the impact of disaster. So from a UNDP perspective, and I think also from a UN perspective, very much critical to the SDGs. You know, we're doing at the moment in UNDP looking to provide some advice to our own country offices about how we can better support our country partners and different partners when it comes to issues of inclusive or microinsurance in particular. And we're trying to come up with a rationale and narrative for it. And for us, it's really key, if you like, that particularly that element of insurance and social welfare is critical for development. And probably when it comes to the SDGs, there's at least 5 particular key ones that it touches upon. Issues of poverty, health, climate change, livelihoods, and gender, and arguably probably much all of them. But those are the sort of the key 5 areas. And we do believe that if we don't invest in issues of invest in issues of tackling recovery from an inclusive approach and using all the tools at our disposal, that we're really not going to be able to tackle these issues and certainly not going to be able to achieve development, especially for those, again, coming back to this point, to those who are most vulnerable, who are in some way more likely to be left behind when we look at the 2030 scenario. So that, in a sense, is what this session is about. That's my, if you like, conception of it as a context. And now I really want to go straight into the panelists and get their views. Just in some of the key questions I have in my mind going through the session, in a sense, which I'd like them all to touch upon as they speak, perhaps, is, well, if my summary of the broad situation is correct, you know, what can we do? What should national governments do, and partners? What should the international system do to support the different ways in which we can invest in particularly ex-ante financing, and how does that work with issues of social welfare? How does that work in terms of recovery and reconstruction financing? I'd really like to get the views of the panelists on that. And how can we use our financing tools, the range of financing tools that we have at our disposal, if you like, to perhaps combat this cycle of recovery and less resilience, and recovery and less resilience that can often occur. And then maybe as a final point, that within this scenario, how can we use the challenge of recovery and the challenge of reconstruction actually as an opportunity to actually do perhaps a better job and to improve the lives of people, especially, again, those who are most vulnerable. So with that, no more ado, I want to go into our first speaker today, who is Mr. Kamal Kishore, if I may say, an alumni of UNDP, if I'm allowed to say that. Very nice to have you here, Kamal, and to hear you speak. Kamal is a member of the National Disaster Management Agency of India, invested a lot, of course, in many aspects of disaster risk reduction. And I'm going to come and sit down now, Kamal, and ask you a few questions just to get things started. And I wonder if you could just maybe frame the conversation in terms of your views on where we are globally in terms of risk reduction, recovery, in terms of Sendai, SDGs, especially from a financing perspective. And then, of course, bring in your experience of India and what you're currently doing.
Thank you, Jan. I had prepared 7 points, but you threw me off with that question. But that's a fair question. What is the current state of financing of different aspects of disaster risk management globally? I'm not sure whether I can give you a global overview, but I can certainly give you an overview from the region that I am based in, India and countries around India. So basically, what I can say is that the current public finance management system for disaster risk management is characterized by 3 things. Number one is that while we have a reasonably robust, predictable mechanism for financing response, immediate response, and you can see exactly 11 days ago we had an extremely severe cyclone hitting our east coast, and we evacuated something like 1.2 million people, and the mortality has gone down by something like 96% over a period of 20 years. But to finance a response like that, there are mechanisms there. You don't have to get any approvals. There is a predictable mechanism for finance. The second is that there is hardly any predictable mechanism for long-term recovery, whether it is from a large-scale disaster or a small-scale disaster or a medium-scale disaster. So, and the third thing that it is characterized by is that although some countries have some sort of funding for risk reduction, mitigation, most countries' mitigation projects are funded through standalone, time-bound, quote-unquote, projects, which basically it has both advantages and disadvantages. Advantages that, there is a sense of urgency because there is a project. The disadvantages that there are issues of sustainability of the outcomes. So that's the sort of landscape that we are looking at. You, in your opening remarks, talked about the protection gap. In terms of the protection gap, while we recognize that there is protection gap and there is much, the insurance market is something which needs to be developed much more. But when it comes to insurance for the common people, I think it would be fair to say that there is a lot of trust deficit. I think this is an issue that we often sidestep as if this doesn't exist. But I think this is a real operational issue in many developing countries, that people simply don't trust that they will get the payout, whether it's indemnity-based insurance or parametric insurance. So that is something we need to consider. So my 3.5 observations on the current state of play on financing disaster risk management in.
May I come back to you with a couple of follow-up questions for that? So I'm just thinking that you mentioned about responses well financed in India, and I'm aware that certainly in the past there are several particularly large funds which perhaps the Prime Minister and maybe decentralized into states can actually call upon in order to pay out even to victims or to those affected. I mean, so there's a lot of structures there. So, and you say that one of the challenges is, well, you don't actually have the necessary similar kinds of tools in terms of recovery and other kinds of things. So what is it going to change? What's it going to take, do you think, in the Indian context in terms of changing that dynamic and shifting away from the more sort of immediate response side?
Well, one is, there are two ways of perhaps handling it. One is to sort of make the financing of response itself a little bit more sophisticated and complex, and you create structures in it where you have provision for immediate response, but also provision for restoration of housing, livelihoods, and so on. The other is to have two separate mechanisms and with two different timelines. So just as we speak, that is something which is being negotiated in India. You know, we have a mechanism called a finance commission, which basically is established every 5 years, which basically has two simple points of in terms of reference. One is they distribute the money between the central government and the states, the total revenue, and then the horizontal distribution. They do it for everything. On disasters, we've been making a case that, you know, we have to really now make a, you know, get into a new generation of financing mechanism, which goes beyond a predictable mechanism for financing relief to financing a whole range of disaster risk management needs, including risk reduction, mitigation, preparedness, as well as recovery, capacity development as well.
So it's almost like it's a much more sort of comprehensive approach in the sense
much more comprehensive approach, and you know, I'm quite hopeful that we will, in a few months, we will have a completely new way of financing disaster risk management in the country.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Kamal. I think I would definitely want to come back to you a little bit later. And I'm also thinking that this issue about market penetration, especially in countries that are evolving from a previous economic system or social model, whatever it might be, is really key. And I would imagine Pranab might have something to talk about that from his perspective from ILO a little bit later, because this issue of both the supply and demand side when it comes to insurance in many countries remains an issue. The trust deficit is certainly part of it when it comes to demand. Now, I'd like to go on to our second speaker now, and I'm now going to call upon, in terms of order, I just want to check the order here. So, yes, we have now Stella Najula Sengendo from the Office of the Prime Minister and from the government of Uganda, who's going to give us a little bit of a presentation on some of her work that she's leading on. And then I'm going to come back to you, Stella, with a few questions as well, just as a follow-up. But I wonder if you could also take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this conference. We, as the government of Uganda, are working on a pre-financed shock responsive safety net, and I would want to share our experience with it and some of the practical or in the field considerations and results that we have got out of this. Our intervention is basically placed within our policy context, in which we approach disaster response and focus on reducing risk of loss of life, property, and livelihoods. So the disaster risk financing, which is the intervention that we are implementing, seeks to reduce risks associated with drought, because this is the major risk that we have in Uganda, mostly faced by people in the northern part of the country. And this is in line with what is our mandate, and the mandate or the department that handles that is disaster preparedness and management. So as a department that is out to implement this disaster risk financing, it seeks to enhance the capacity of the country to contain and minimize the effects of disaster, address disaster vulnerabilities of the community, and alleviate suffering due to disasters and prevent and prepare the country against disasters. So in terms of preparedness, looking at preparedness rather than response, what are the things that we need to do in order to make this work? We need to ensure that we can reduce the impact or the effect of disasters on the vulnerable. And that's where we are going. So our capacity to predict, where possible, prevent the disaster, mitigate that impact, and then respond effectively to cope with the consequences. So in a way, as the government, our capacity to coordinate is very important so that we can reduce wastage of resources, of time, and efforts. The DRF mechanism really works through ensuring that we can scale up assistance to the poor and vulnerable households and when a disaster situation is anticipated. And these beneficiary households receive a seasonal transfer or a cash transfer for their participation in labor-intensive public work. So the method of delivery is they get a transfer when they participate in labor-intensive public works. This transfer they can use to sustain their livelihoods, smoothen consumption, increase assets, and also create savings. So in a way, we try to see how we can build further resilience beyond the cash transfer. And this additional support enables them also create assets that in a way can prevent them or mitigate the impact of drought. So when I talk about the assets, these assets include things like valley tanks and dams, especially in an area where water is scarce. And this happens for most of the year. It has only one running crop season, but most of the time the crops are destroyed as they're in the field, and really they don't get so much of a harvest. The weather is harsh, and so we need to ensure that periodically they are able to gain water for production. This is a pastoralist area. Many of the households keep livestock, and water is very important. In the past, before we had the disaster risk financing, we had a lot of drought happening in this area. There were frequent droughts. But then we, as the government, were only able to respond rather than reduce the risk. This was considered morally wrong because there were loss of lives. People died, there was suffering, and there was a whole long process within which, as development partners, as government, we had to, first of all, ask ourselves, has it really happened? So there are assessments that have to happen. We go through an appeals process, we do a fundraising, and still, sometimes the money doesn't come through because, as Uganda, where we are situated, we are in the Horn of Africa, right? But there are countries with competing demands and more valid demands. For, if you look at Somalia, at Kenya, when a drought happens, theirs is more intense than ours. But that doesn't take away the fact that we still have people who are affected to the same extent, probably, as the people maybe in Somalia. Maybe the populations are less. So we needed to have a mechanism of financing that will help us overcome this. So without financing, we had a lot of negative coping, and whenever a drought happened, it would push people back into poverty. There were a lot of human and economic costs, and sometimes the government would have to draw funding away from basic services and divert them to addressing this disaster. So what does the DRF do for us? Before the disaster, or before we had the DRF, we had this funding gap. And the funding gap basically meant that we had to take time to mobilize the funds, and by the time you respond, you have lost lives. So when this kind of adaptive social protection mechanism, which is the DRF, was put in place, we were able to bridge this gap, reduce the gap, in that the government had contingent funding at hand whenever the disaster happened, or even before the disaster happened. So this kind of financing, we knew that definitely if a disaster is predicted, you'll have predictable payouts. You already know how many days these people are going to work or contribute their labor into the works, and you know that within this period of time, they will receive payments. So it was very predictable. So The DRF provides a faster protection for poorer households. As I've said, it's a contingent line of credit, provides liquidity for the country whenever a natural disaster is anticipated. And what we mean here is that instead of going through the whole process when a disaster happens, where you go through relief, recovery, and reconstruction, all that needs money. You instead inject the DRF before the disaster happens. So you would not have to go through the whole continuum of events of relief, recovery, and reconstruction. In a way, you save money by injecting that financing at that opportune time and be able to retain the households at their livelihood line. So with pre-financing, we are able to invest in human capital, and we'll later hear that these people, when they receive the financing, in terms of the populations that receive the financing, they are able to send their children to school, buy clothing, they're able to spend on their food, and they're able to access health services. So the pre-financing has also helped us manage the shock better. Within the last 3 years that we've had the DRF, we have not had drought reported or famine events reported in that part of the country. And as government, we have resources to respond immediately, and we know that the households do not have to employ negative coping. Previously, they had to beg, they had to migrate, move to towns, and so on, but this, in a way, has helped them cope because they stay back to participate in the labor-intensive public works as another way of coping. So how is this disaster risk financing activated? Yesterday, we talked about the reliance on satellite data. And for us, satellite data is very important. We are using the Global Agriculture Monitoring GLAM, which is put in place by NASA, the Maryland University, and the UCDA. And this is helping us get information on the behavior of vegetation, that's the NDVI which we are using, over a planting season. So we monitor this over the planting season, but in combination with using the satellite data, we also do ground truthing, and then we have also other mechanisms or other protocols that we follow to assess food security situations. So this information all put together enables us to make that decision. And this is all governed by a trigger. There is a trigger that has been set in place, and this is based on historical data that was taken over a period of 15 years in this region to determine to what extent droughts occurred and who were the affected and to what extent finances had to be put in to relieve this population. So this trigger, though, has to be reviewed continuously by what we have as a DRF technical committee that really sits within the disaster reduction platform. And when the trigger goes off, a drought is indicated, and this financing goes out to meet a daily wage for a period of 54 days. The principles basically behind any financing that we would like to propose would be one, the financing has to be in place if you are to practice this kind of pre-financing or preparedness, and a system to ensure that the money reaches the beneficiaries. A disbursement system that works, that is fast enough to get money on time to them. The right information for you to make the sound decisions. We have the objective data that we're getting from the satellite imagery, but then in addition to this is the other data that comes along with it. Looking at the financial instruments, not only, this one is meant for the vulnerable, the poor, but then also there are farmers that are more, or you could say the middle class, or the people who can afford to pay for the premiums. You have to have an agricultural insurance for the better off. So we're not just looking at one financial instrument, but we are trying to see if we can have different financial instruments. The reserves and allocations, contingent funding that the government maybe could draw from other sectors to help whenever a crisis occurs. And then we are operating behind a spirit of no regrets. What this means is that during the cropping season, if a trigger goes off, it means that you will intervene no matter what, even if the situation improves. So in the case of the region where we operate, you'll find instances when during the planting season, there may be a constraint with water, with the rain, but then if the trigger goes off, it means you still intervene, even if the rain resumes after that. So it means that at some point in that planting season, if there's an interruption, there will be a problem with the yields. Definitely there will be some individuals or some families that will not make it because probably they have less land, they have grown fewer crops, less diversity of crops, so they are more affected than others. So your job is to identify who are the most affected, see where they are found, and be able to intervene at that point. So whatever happens, you have to intervene, and that helps at least for the inclusion and making sure that everyone is covered. This system is also adapted to the agricultural activity or the local context, in that it moves along the agricultural season and ensuring that when interventions happen, it does not interrupt the agricultural season in any way. And the trigger mechanism is really based on objective data. So for Uganda, we have been able to have 3 rounds of financing. In 2017, when we faced a drought, we used US dollar 4.1 million, and this was made payouts to 31,000 households. What is beautiful about this is that you're able to scale down. If a drought doesn't happen, or if the extent of drought is less than the previous year, still you can intervene, but then reduce the number of households over which you have to give the transfer. So the next year, which was 2018, it was 23,000, and then in 2019, we've gone down to 20,000 households. And I can say that from my commissioner in the office of the Prime Minister, he did say that in the past we always reacted to crop failure by spending billions of shillings to provide food aid. In 2017, where we experienced drought, it was the first time we acted proactively because we did have clear evidence from satellite data very early in the season. And this help went out immediately. So for the government of Uganda, we've had a significant reduction in food aid. In that area of more than half of the amount of money that we used to use for food aid. There have been other dividends, there have been other benefits. In terms of looking at the pillars of resilience, there's been an improvement in some development indicators related to consumption, in that the number of households that had to consume 1 meal a day reduced evidently over the time that we implemented this project. And then also we have had an improvement in terms of assets, productive assets. You look at the households, for instance, women that have been able to acquire, whether it's small livestock, so these are the small ruminants, the goats, the sheep. This has gone up compared to before this intervention. Also, there has been an improvement in terms of health and access to health and education. Yes, they build assets such as the roads, community access roads, the valley tanks and so on, but their access has also improved. In this financing, there's also inclusion for the people who we call the unable-bodied. 10% of any financing that goes out to any of these districts goes to 10% goes to the unable-bodied. These are the people who will not be able to participate in the public works. The pregnant women, the disabled, the elderly. And it's a condition for approval of any sub-project that has to go for consideration under the Labor Intensive Public Works. I would like to end there on our submission to the conference.
Thank you very much, Stella. I mean, I wonder if I can just ask you, just before handing over to our next speaker, just ask you to touch upon one point, of which there were many interesting points. I mean, one of the ones you touched upon at the end there, for example, the knock-on effects, how this work in itself is having an impact well beyond agriculture into issues of health and livelihoods and other kinds of things. And I think that's one of the narratives we're trying I'm trying to push, for example, in UNDP, that actually the value of insurance or risk financing is not even sometimes the product or even what it protects, but what it allows people to do. As well as what it may allow them, what it may also otherwise protect beyond the actual product itself. So I think that's a really key point, which I think is an added value point, which sometimes I think we don't express. But if I may ask you one particular point, which is that, delivering development, if you like, an integrated approach, if I'm understanding, you're delivering a set of activities to support farmers and communities based on a trigger. Now, that's a little bit of a different approach from how development is often done, or just the way we do things in generally. Going back to Kamal's point about, we have things in projects, or, we have rural development plans. They're not usually based in this way. Can I just ask you to reflect on that? Is that a challenge? Is that changing people's mindsets? Or is actually that's just you being able to maneuver different actors within government to do things in a different way?
In a way, it is helping us as government to do things in a different way, because when we look at the trigger, it's objective data. It's real data that you're using. And previously, if you gave funds, for instance, to a district, that's our administrative kind of grouping, you find that it's likely that one area will be favored because probably a person comes from there. But where we use a trigger, when you have all this data and the reasons why this area qualifies rather than the other area, then there is fairness. And in a way, no one argues that why did you go here and not here? So there is fairness, there is transparency, and it's clear how it's being done. In terms of the other question, which was...
just in the sense how actually you're delivering the services that you're doing. Is this a considerable change from the way government was providing services?
Yes, definitely.
In
the past, we didn't have so much of the service being backed by data. And we've had to build our capacity in terms of setting up what we call a National Emergency Coordination Center under the department, where we ensure and have people who can do analysis. So it's not just the data on rainfall or just the data on NDVI and all that. There's a lot of other data that goes out, for instance, on the prices in these areas, the way trade is happening, if there are any scarcities that are occurring. So in a way, it's more backed by data. And then we have an information resource that goes out, a newsletter that goes out, even as far as to the districts and to what we call our district disaster management committees, to inform them of what the situation is likely to be. So in a way, it's more of early warning, not what we used to do, wait for the disaster to happen and then react. But repeatedly now, we do not have situations where we are running to the donor to ask, okay, this is happening, we need money, let's come together. We don't have that anymore. And I think for Uganda, I can evidently say that the past 3 years, there's been a difference in the way we've been doing business in regard to relief. We don't have so much relief going out. Rather, it has been seen as a way to even, the logistics behind relief, the trucks, everything that happens with relief. They have noticed that now you could give these people a transfer, a cash transfer that actually saves you all the logistical hassle, and you can get things faster to them.
Okay, thank you very much. You know what, just before I hand over to Dr. Richard, I just want to ask, Kamal, may I ask you to come back to this particular point? I was just thinking in terms of comparisons. Uganda, obviously in Africa, a population of about 44 million people. India, a very large country, 1.3 billion. The kind of changes of development mindset, is that much more complex in the India example? What will that mean, if you like, if you extrapolate what Stella is saying into the Indian example?
I think there are two, one of course there is the issue of scale, but there are two other differences. One is that India is not one place, it's many places. And there is a lot of diversity. The second thing is that what was presented by a colleague from Uganda is mostly in the context of drought, where the kind of early warning you're able to provide. So in fact, to a large extent, if I look at how drought risk management happens in India and how we support people who are affected by drought directly or indirectly, there are some similarities there. So it's also what I'm trying to say is that the system of protection, social protection, is not hazard neutral. You would have to have a different strategy for events which are low frequency, high impact, as opposed to events which occur 3 times in 5 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for that. Thank you for that. Now I'd like to hand over to our next speaker, who is Dr. Richard Kuma. Dr. Richard is from the State Department of Livestock, Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries from the Government of Kenya, and I think he has a short presentation also to elaborate on some of their work in this space.
Thank you, Jan, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to my presentation. As Jan has said, my name is Richard Kuma. I come from Kenya. I'm working for the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program, and I want to discuss with you on the progress we've made so far, and I'll pitch my discussion on the transition from asset replacement to asset protection, the progress we have registered so far, and the impacts. To justify why Kenya Livestock Insurance is, as my colleague from Uganda has said, we come from a region which is frequently ravaged by drought, and previously we've been more reactive in dealing with the drought, that is intervening after it has done all the destruction. Now, in the current past, and specifically the 2008-2011 drought, and after the post-disaster needs assessment, it was found that that drought period costed the Kenyan economy close to 1 trillion Kenya shillings, and over 70% of those losses was associated to the pastoral livestock production systems. So there was a clear need to shift the approach from reactive to proactive drought management interventions, and that's how the concept of a livestock insurance program was conceived. And it is during this period when the International Livestock Research Institute, IRLI, had successfully piloted an indexed-based livestock insurance, and it had registered some considerable success. And the government made a deliberate decision to adopt this concept and implement it in its strategies and approaches to drought management using the instruments of insurance. The way we've been doing it for the last 4 years is in these drought prone areas, which are predominantly livestock keeping areas. We go out in these regions we call counties and identify the vulnerable members of the society, which is a critical number of them. And in each of these, we protect the critical breeding herd, which is equivalent to 5 cows. And for those 5 cows, mature cows, we give 100% subsidy in terms of a livestock insurance policy. So in the case there is severe forage deficiency, which in the absence of any other interventions, these animals can succumb. At that critical point, which we call the trigger, and my colleague from Uganda has alluded to it, that's the point at which the insurance product is activated and the necessary payouts are done directly to the insured beneficiaries. And that way we enable them to protect their critical assets from destruction out of the effects of drought. The original design was as a replacement, and this was from the 2010 to 2013, and it was designed to act as an insurance product for replacing what has been lost. So the original, the first contract was designed to replace, to replace against livestock debts, and out of the 3 years of implementation and trials in a region called Marsabit County, we encountered serious challenges, and this helped us to change course. And some of the challenges we encountered was this contract was more responsive when the droughts had reached catastrophic levels. What that means is we are intervening when there is massive losses, and we were not really achieving the objective. And basically, in insurance language, the question of basis risk came into question because there was no, we were intervening when there were massive losses, one. Two, there are cases when we were in severe drought and there were no compensation taking place. And three, you could also find situations where you are intervening and yet there is no drought. So that made us change tact, and it was coupled with an availability of mortality data, which was to be compared with the data coming from the satellites. All this complexity helped us to change tact, and we went to asset protection. And here we are observing forage availability continuously within a growing season. And based on the behavior of forage, an insurance product is designed, which triggers when the forage scarcity has reduced to very dire levels, where in the absence of an external intervention, these animals can starve to death. Is that a critical point we call the trigger point, where we are disbursing the insurance payouts to enable the farmers, the pastorists, keep the animals alive during the dry period. And we did this in line with the international agreed projections going forward, and specifically the ILO recommendation of 205 of 2017, which encourages the creation of an enabling environment for sustainability and initiatives to access finance with emphasis on prevention, because we are trying to keep these animals alive so that we don't lose them. Going forward, the cost of the insured unit is the cost of keeping this animal alive during the dry period. And we put more emphasis on the science of remote sensing, so that it's an objective way of telling this area is more deficient than the other, and it justifies compensation as compared to the other area. Currently, we are in almost more than half of the country in terms of this product rollout. And we are in 8 counties of our country. These are large areas, largely more than half of the country. And what we've been registered for the last 4 years is we have 18,000 households, and equivalent to around 120,000 beneficiaries under our cover. And since inception, we have bought insurance premiums in the open insurance market of 706 million Kenya shillings. And at the same period, we have made payouts of 790 million shillings. This is money paid by insurance companies to the beneficiaries direct to their pockets through mobile money systems and the bank transfers, but directly to their pockets. And this comes in handy for them to intervene at the critical stage when they need support. So far, we have managed to protect around 900,000 cows, an equivalent of 900 cows, valued at 4.5 billion Kenya shillings. The impact we have registered so far is we have enabled the pastoralists, the pastoral livestock keeping communities to access feed and forage during dry period. We have improved the ability to access water during the difficult times of drought. And the vet services have equally improved, and we have saved pastoral loss during these dry periods, the difficult periods of drought. Overall, the improved pastoral drought disaster management strategy has improved, and we have managed to stabilize the production systems. I must say we are enjoying tremendous political goodwill going forward. This is exemplified by the head of state getting time to accompany us during one of the payout payout activities, just to show the strong political goodwill we are enjoying, and we need to build on this goodwill going forward, because we have managed to address a situation which has been a challenge for so many years going forward. Out of the lessons learned, we have been providing 100% subsidy as a public good, and we realize this is an insurance product which ultimately should be market-led. It should be an insurance product like any other. So going forward, we are introducing partial subsidy actually from this year, where those people who have been enjoying our 100% subsidy in terms of insurance cover, we are now encouraging them to buy part of that insurance as the government tops the remaining bit. But ultimately, we are trying to put in systems or structures which will enable the voluntary market, the commercial aspect, to gain traction, so that going forward, in the intervening years, we want to see the livestock insurance getting its own traction and getting its own life going forward. And to achieve this, there is massive need for public education. As the colleague from India just noted, that there is a lot of suspicion in insurance products, and we really need to. And remember, we are targeting the most disadvantaged member of the community, the most disadvantaged members of the community. These are the pastoralists in our country. So public education is quite important to enable them understand how it works and how the potential benefits. Although this has really been activated or given a jerk by the entry of the public-funded Kenya Livestock Insurance product, it has enabled us to prove, as a proof of concept to these pastoralists, to the doubting Thomases, yes, it works. Now moving it to the private sector becomes a lot easier. And again, for efficiency, because when you are preventing the efficiency of resource access is key, we need to institute electronic systems for data management to enable us to transfer these resources and targeting in an efficient way. And ultimately, we have to anchor these emerging technologies which we have done proof of concept of through public policy and implementation strategy development or design, to enable them to make sure they are anchored within the public finance discourse, so that we are assured of their perpetuity going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richard. I mean, a lot again, really, to get to grips with there. I mean, a number of things which just really struck me, just right at the end, you're talking about that point which Kamal actually started about the issue of trust being central to actually the delivery and success of the product. And I'm struck by the sort of one of the main challenges of maybe inclusive or micro-insurance, which is provision of those of insurance, particularly to those who are bottom of the pyramid, to use that construction, which I don't really like, but that's one we use. You're targeting particularly those people who are already excluded financially from lots of other things, financial services. So that issue of trust is probably even more obvious if you wanted to provide insurance to the middle class. The middle class probably already have bank accounts, and maybe they have pensions, and maybe they have something else. So there is a sort of a double job, if you like. But I think that's one of the ways in which actually insurance can be a catalyst for something else. And again, I come back to this issue of catalyst, because I think in your, again, penultimate slide, you pointed out how this initiative based on insurance, or has insurance at its core, the changing from the replacement of something to the prevention of something, in a sense, at its core, is providing better ways of delivering services and better quality of services for population in terms of early warning and productive assets and so forth. I think that's really key, and one of the key points why I think that insurance and risk financing adds considerable value for development. Now, if I may, I'm going to go straight to our final speaker, Mr. Pranav Prashad from ILO, who's Senior Technical Officer and our co-organizer for this event. So thank you for that, Pranav, if I may say. Now, Pranav, I wonder if I am allowed to a little bit give you my job, which is to a little bit summarize where we are so far, having heard from our three speakers, talking about three different examples of work from three different countries and different contexts. And I wonder what you would say in terms of how does what you've heard so far and your experience working with ILO fit into the idea that we're using insurance as financing as something which is part and parcel of development rather than something which is somehow we do separate. And maybe particularly on these issues of insurance as a productive and protective tool. Maybe you could just start there.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. So actually, it's very heartening from our perspective, and as you very rightly said, from the development perspective, to see this move of use of financial services and insurance, not after the event, but before the event. So insurance is just one of the tools, but there is a very heartening thing that seems to be evolving of preparing for disasters rather than having to cope with it later. Of course, as you've seen, the role of the government is critical. But one of the biggest lessons learned is that it's not a one person's job. This multi-stakeholder job is extremely critical, and therefore the evolution of public-private partnerships, coordination between the government and the public and the private sector, coordination between different levels of government, central versus state governments, central and state governments. I think that's a very nice emerging trend that we've seen, a common issue that seems to be emerging. Related to that, since you started out with SDGs, I'd just like to add on one more SDG of SDG 17, which is based on partnerships. So I think for this entire issue of disaster risk reduction and building resilience, partnerships and working together is extremely important. Yes, there are challenges, but there are facilitators in the system too that seems to be coming into play. One big facilitator and a common thread that we may have seen is the growing use of technology. So while Kamal talked about early warning systems, Stella talked of triggers initiating a payout, Richard talked about how technology is being used in terms of getting fodder and water systems in place before the event itself to prevent the assets for the pastoralists. I think technology itself is a great player that is there. I think one more common issue that we from the development sector focus on is the availability and the quality of data that enables technology and that enables decision-making, that enables private players also to play a role in that. And data issue is extremely important because not only does it have to be relevant and accurate, it also needs to be accessible and accessible by the relevant people. So there's an issue of accessibility, there's an issue of accuracy, there's an issue on affordability of data because in a lot of places data is not cheap. And then, of course, is the issue of how many of its usage in the current format and how it can be used as an effective tool. You mentioned this issue about productive use of insurance. So I think no better examples than the two examples that we've seen here, where insurance, besides protecting the people, is enabling them to do other stuff, what they actually want to do. We regard insurance and we regard basically preparedness and financial services as facilitators to this productive use, whether it is in terms of access to credit or access to better inputs. Farmers, insured farmers have access to, well, of course, better seeds and better fertilizers. And studies after studies have shown that insured farmers in Ghana, in India, have almost extended their use of fertilizers by almost 24%. And land usage has been increased by up to 17% in various areas, which has allowed a basic economic logic to follow through that the more you produce, the more you are able to kind of use and get revenues from. In China, insured farmers increased the quality of the poultry that they were looking at against the non-insured farmers. The issue of value from financial services and the value of financing and preparing for disaster risks, consumption levels haven't fallen in terms of a drought. Kenyan farmers have reduced should we say, panic selling in terms of drought, and pastoralists have reduced it by almost 23% in certain cases. Not just in agriculture and livestock, but health indicators, because of insurance, can actually have shown improvement with lower out-of-pocket expenses, better access to and better usage of health services in various countries. So therefore, we feel that access to financial services and insurance in particular actually helps in this entire exercise of building a better world over a period of time in that sense of the term. Two more issues that I'd just like to quickly touch about is the importance of, you mentioned a comprehensive approach some time back, so this entire integrated approach. So financial services by themselves or just financing disaster risk on its own doesn't work. It needs to follow a fully integrated approach if you are to look at resilience as a central core to the entire activity. So it's prevention, it's risk transfer through insurance, it's the role for international players that work, and of course, very important, the response that you get and the time lag that can actually be looked at. One overarching scheme that we've seen happening is the important role for, of course, the government and the subsidies that go to it. We've seen the Kenya example where it's kind of 100% subsidized initially and now moving towards 50%. Large schemes in India driven by the central government, the Fasal Bima Yojana crop insurance scheme fixes the premium at 2% and balance is paid between the central and the state governments. So I guess government has a huge role to play, not just in subsidies, but also as in setting up regulations that allows the private players to come in and have a play and contribute to the entire process. Kamal very elegantly brought up the issue of trust deficit, but I guess that's where I see the regulations, etc., playing a good role in making it possible and effective for private players to play a role. And we've seen in Kenya that the payouts have been in far in excess of the premiums received, which means that the industry and the private players would be keen to kind of contribute and play and have the entire system playing, whether it is in reinsurance with international organizations or transferring the risks out of the country, to actually contribute at the beneficiary level. The other issue related to this trust deficit is this entire issue of understanding of how financial services work. So this entire issue of consumer awareness and education. And when I say consumer awareness, I don't really mean just the final consumers, but there is a big need of creating awareness and educating at all levels, whether it is the implementing organizations, whether it is the extension officers for the government who are supposed to be the first point of contact, whether it is the private companies themselves who kind of have competition between themselves but also want to get a bigger share of the government pie. There is a huge need for a total understanding of how the financial systems can work. And I guess if everybody kind of comes together in that sort of way, it will be right steps are being taken and will continue to be taken in that regard. Let me stop here at this point.
Thank you, Pranav, for that. Just an excellent summary of some of the main key issues. I just want to throw one of your points at the end, if I may, to Dr. Richard, just before we open up for a Q&A for the last 20 minutes, because Pranav, you talked about regulations and the enabling environment, if you like, for actually the delivery or development and delivery of insurance services. And I noted that, Dr. Richard, you finished your presentation by talking about political leadership and how, the political class, in a sense, has to be behind these areas. I wonder if you could just give us a few minutes on the Kenyan experience of how this relates in terms of, the actual regulations you have, the institutions that you have, and maybe the political support you have to make changes, and maybe just give a minute or two on your experience in that area.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Yes, in Kenya, this concept is strong, has a very strong political backing. We are enjoying tremendous political goodwill going forward, and that's why deliberately I flashed a slide where the head of state, the president himself, got time and accompanied us in a very simple exercise of just giving out the cash payment, just exemplifying the magnitude of encouragement and goodwill is extending to this kind of processes. But also, we are also supported by our insurance regulatory systems in the country. We have a very strong and vibrant insurance regulatory authority, which also makes sure that this product adheres to sound insurance protocols and principles, so that our customers keep on building trust going forward. But more importantly, on the regulatory and entrenching the process, is building on policy frameworks to entrench it within the public planning and financing procedures, such that it's not a one-off thing. Does not depend on the current government ideologies, so that you are sure to sustain it going forward. And as you do that, you keep on tapping and growing on technological advancements, so that it remains relevant going forward. And also on the issues of trust, this money needs to go when it's needed and going to the right people, so that people continually keep on building trust in the insurance products. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Richard. I think that was an excellent way, actually, maybe to finish things there, talking about how a multifaceted approach from government. It's not just a single approach. It's not just about the actors doing insurance, but it's the political will, it's the regulators, it's the legislative system in which you actually do the work, which is key. Pranav, did you want to come back on something just before we open it up? I can see your hand raised there.
No, just related to this, and when we say multifaceted approaches, see, you've heard examples of technology being used, you've heard examples of payments being made directly to wallets. So when we talk of regulations, we just don't mean insurance regulations, or we don't just mean regulation related to agriculture. There is a play between, let's say, the finance ministry, the telecommunication ministry, the agricultural ministry, or whichever is the relevant, or the health ministry in that case. So it requires coordination and work between all of them, because all of them have their own criteria on which to work. So I think that's where a lot of this facilitative process can be played by the government, not just giving subsidies and then letting the system tail roll, but actually proactively ensuring that X knows what Y is doing and how Y can support X in doing that particular activity. So that's where we feel that neutral parties such as us from the development sector can work with organizations to help and facilitate such processes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pranav. That's a good ending there. If I may, I'd like to throw it out to the floor for questions. We have 23 minutes, according to my timepiece here. So we'll have one question here, or just to see, to see how many hands we might get from the beginning. Got one and two gentlemen there. Maybe we'll start there, and this gentleman here. So we'll take all four of those, and then we'll see. I'll frame them accordingly. So if I may, if you could ask a question. Do we have a microphone? We could just so the others can hear. And actually, so I can hear, which would be useful. Yeah. The lady.
Thank you, Jan, for great moderation, and to all of the panelists for your comments, especially from a national perspective, which was really helpful. My name is Coco Warner. I'm from the UN Climate Secretariat, and I'm curious, from India, Uganda, Kenya, or maybe Pranav for your global overview working with ILO, to what extent are countries considering future needs? And basically what I'm trying to understand is there a needs-based approach to finance? In the world of climate, we're anticipating impacts, as both of you mentioned, agriculture. Maybe there are impacts on crop yields with drought or other kinds of climatic-related risks, how do you build that into your disaster risk finance plans? And again, the question is providing basic human needs such as maybe adequate food, since both of you mentioned agriculture.
Okay, great. Maybe to the gentleman here, because he's geographically close by, before we go over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Dao Zhang from FAO Forestry Department. Just want to compliment the panel for your excellent presentation. I just want to point out the protection gap is not only in developing countries, but in developing countries as well. I give you two examples. In France, there was a big storm in 1999, 2019, in the Aquitaine region of the forest. It was destroyed, lots of forest. The French government says, okay, we pay the insurance this time, we regulate you. By 2017, you have to pay by insurance. Otherwise, next storm comes, we do not pay. Look at the result. 2017 passed. Less than 5% of the forest landowner buy any private insurance. The same thing in the United States. 98% of the private forest landowner do not buy insurance. Their forests are subject to hurricane, fire, insects, and disease. So the gap exists everywhere. I think your approach in terms of partial subsidy, regulation, and private and public partnership is the right way to go. The gap, the supply and demand does not meet in private insurance market. The willingness to pay for landowner for timberland insurance is 0.3% premium. What I'm saying is that they insure $3 for every $1,000 assets, but the insurance company charged 0.8 to 1%. So there is a gap of, talking roughly about 50 to 70% higher. That's my comment. Very excellent panel, very excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a well-taken comment, and we'll frame some of that in the questions. There was two questions there from the two gentlemen and also this lady here. So we'll take those, and then I'll feed them to the panel, if I may.
Thank you very much for the pleasant presentations. My name is Mati Mayati from Botswana, and we are a country that is very prone to drought. And the presentations from Uganda and Kenya are very, very interesting to me. I think I will even want to be in touch with them after this. My question is, where does the government get the funding for paying out the beneficiaries during drought? Specifically, I want to know if the government has bought an insurance, has reinsured this risk, maybe in the private markets, outside the big reinsuring companies, or they get the money from their coffers. Because if that is the case, in my view, I feel that this is unsustainable, because the way or the frequency that the droughts occur in our countries makes it very unsustainable if the government will use their own coffers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then we just take the last two questions, if we could. Jonathan there, from the two colleagues there in the audience.
Well, good morning and great presentation. My question is kind of related to Madam's intervention. In that, regarding the insurance scheme, what advice do you have for those countries whose insurance scheme is not well developed? And then, given the fact that the way disaster comes in, sometimes it comes, in a huge form where, for example, the mitigation in terms of the insurance scheme that you might have or the coverage that you have as far as the premium arrangement with the insurance company is concerned. So then when the disaster happens, sometimes the risk exposure is such that mitigation becomes a problem, and then the insurance companies are all of a sudden put under pressure in terms of meeting the financing requirement to make good those that are actually affected. And that takes me to the next point. In those countries where the insurance scheme is not very well developed, do you recommend having trust funds? Because I saw developing reserves as one of the mechanisms. So do you think trust funds would rather work for those countries? Or how do they transcend beyond their national boundary in terms of developing the insurance scheme to cover the risk exposure in terms of disaster? Thank you. By the way, my name is Bakri from the Gambia, one of the delegation members.
Thank you very much, moderator, and good morning, everyone. My name is Mapaka Dawu. I come from South Africa. I want to appreciate the very thoughtful presentations that have been made. We can learn a lot from that. I have few questions, Mr. Moderator. They are directed to a colleague from Kenya, and of course, the colleague from Uganda, but others can still make inputs. The first issue relates to the documentation of the farmers. Basically to establish whether you have a farmer register in the country, and with farmers being categorized according to their level: commercial farmers, smallholder farmers, subsistence farmers, so that you are able to determine those that will qualify for support, because some of them might be running commercially, and by extension they might be sustainable and having other safety mechanisms. The second issue is in your allocation, are you able to differentiate between insured losses and uninsured losses, so that you don't have double dipping, in terms of the support being provided? The third issue, I think the phenomenon that was was implicated here is mainly drought, but farmers are also affected by pests and diseases. Do we also have a mechanism to ensure farmers against infestation of pests and diseases? But lastly, in providing the support, do we have safeguards to ensure that there are no unintended consequences in terms of over-reliance of farmers on state support, so that they don't end up growing, practicing risk mitigation measures and growing to become commercial farmers, as they are continually dependent on government to provide support? Lastly, what about small-scale foresters and fisheries? Are they also supported in that scheme of things? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, for those questions. I'm going to have to break these up into a few different questions for different people, I think. Now, I think that we have one question here from the gentleman that, sorry, from the lady here. Coco, of course I know, but I say the lady because everyone will know. And which is about, okay, how can we make sure that there's a need-based approach to what we do in financing? And then we have, I think, so the question on the note you made on the universality of the problem, I think is well taken, but maybe not a question, but we'll maybe get people to reflect on making sure that everybody has the necessary access that they should have. There's the issue about where does government get the funding from? And I guess related also to the final point from the gentleman there in terms of, well, is it sustainable? What's the sustainability of the models that we have? And there's also issues about, well, how can we look at other kinds of things that should be covered, such as pest diseases, fisheries, and other areas. So what I think I'll start with is, maybe I'll go to Kamal first, and ask you, Kamal, because I'm thinking also, I mean, actually drought, India, I mean, massive impact. The 1993 drought, if I remember, affected something like 100 million people, and there was a GDP loss of more than 2%. Agricultural GDP. I wonder if you could look at this question which talks about the sustainability of models and how you, because you're also looking at this in the future about changing from the response system to a more overall system. Wonder you could look at that question for us.
Well, three main responses to the notion of sustainability. I think a predictable mechanism which supports in times of disasters is cost effective and hence in the long run, and hence it is sustainable by itself. A lot of inefficiencies in the existing financing mechanisms creep in if it is not pre-planned. And that brings me to one point, that while we are talking about insurance, one point that needs to be discussed is how do the existing plans and schemes of governments converge to achieve a common outcome. So you have a payout from insurance, you have a payout from a standard relief package, you have a payout from a pre-existing agricultural development scheme, and they're all managed by different institutions who don't talk to each other, and they provide support to the farmer at different points so that each one of those three are subcritical. How do we actually achieve the maximum impact by achieving convergence in the mechanisms that already exist? I think that if we did that, then I think the issue of sustainability also begins to address itself. I think there are a lot of inefficiencies at the operational level which also need to be addressed, and not just look at the conceptual issues of what is a best framework for managing risk.
Okay. Sorry, apologize. Thank you, Kamal. I would have liked you to talk about 30 minutes on that subject, but we don't necessarily have the time today. But I want to pass on to Stella next. And maybe, Stella, you can build upon what Kamal has said. But I wonder if you could talk about, maybe slide from the issue about sustainability and talk about the role of government, and particularly about how government can actually pay for that. So I think if Kamal's looking at this from a systemic point of view in terms of all the different actors that actually have to come together to deliver something which actually will do what it's supposed to do. Well, how is that going to be paid for long term in some countries and contexts where perhaps finances are stretched, and maybe also because those are the people who, right at the start, who we're looking to support who don't have the money?
As a government, governments, at least my government in Uganda is, of course, got a grant from the World Bank in order to finance this as a pilot. And given the success of the pilot, and given that we're able through this intervention, it's not yet complete, but we've been able to do a lot of monitoring and evaluation after each trigger to show what the benefit is. In the first year, when we cut down to the relief, which we saved about 9.6 billion Uganda shillings. These savings that the government was able to make out of its own funds that it used to use for financing relief, it was able to use in other places. So in a way, even if the government has gotten a grant that eventually has to be paid back, we still believe that the success or benefits that are realized in these interventions will speak for themselves, so that eventually, and we are looking at the government, we've been talking with the Ministry of Finance to allocate funds in order to continue the financing of this money, or where we can get this money for, especially the vulnerable, because these are not people who can pay premiums, they cannot pay partial for insurance and so on. But then also the aspect of looking at the different levels or categorization of farmers, so that you find that, okay, yeah, they are the vulnerable ones, that the ones that will not be able to pay. So a provision is being made by the government to ensure that we can continue the financing, but then also prevent over-reliance. Because, I mean, if farmers or vulnerable people get used to this kind of financing, I believe it may create some kind of over-reliance or dependency syndrome. So to prevent that, especially for the vulnerable, is to create an aspect where even when they get this transfer in the initial period, there is some voluntary savings that they have to make. And we are providing some kind of technical backstopping to see that they are financially included in terms of use of banking services and so on. And these savings are brought together in a group. They may be, individual savings are quite small, but then when they are put together for a big group of farmers, they may be poor farmers. But then we know that this funding that we have is not permanent and it's not sustainable. But then how do we move it such that after the funding has elapsed, these farmers can continue on their own? So there's a big aspect of financial inclusion, ensuring that we can teach the farmers to save, and also we encourage, there's a voluntary saving that is made out of the cash transfer that's kept back at the banks, in the local banks, and then after a project has been completed, they come together and are facilitated to form groups and then be able to carry on investments. There may be small investments that they're able to do in their own villages, and this, we believe, will allow us to continue even when the funding is ended. I think that's my comment here.
Thank you, Stella. I mean, I'm taking from your answer that the long-term view is indeed is building, if you like, a community who can actually pay for themselves in terms of the services and products which are actually providing them with resilience. But actually, it is a long-term view. It's not something which can be quite easily addressed. I wonder if we can then transfer this question then to Richard, and to take this on from Stella, because I noted in your presentation that you've already made, if you like, had some successes in terms of looking to transfer the initial parts of the program over years, now looking to have some of the subsidy paid by the beneficiaries of that work. But I want you can also reflect upon just a question that came from Coke at the front here about this issue about ensuring that we're still reflecting on those who are perhaps most in need, and how you can bring those into the program as you're also looking to also support a population who are maybe coming out of poverty in some ways, and partly through the support of the program. What's the long-term view look like for the work that you're doing?
Thank you, John. For the long-term view of what we are doing, I cannot run away from discussing sustainability, which has also come from the floor. And our work has been questioned a lot in terms of that area of sustainability, because we are now providing 100% subsidy in the form of insurance. How does it portend going forward? And that's why we introduced this aspect of partial subsidy for those who have already enjoyed our support for the last 4 years. So those, they know it works, and they have seen its benefit to themselves. So we want to see how they are responding to the partial subsidy going forward. But initially, the indication is quite positive. Positive in the sense that as we roll out the government-funded, 100% funded insurance product, there is an equivalent product, the same product out there in the commercial, being done commercially by the insurance companies themselves. And what we've seen is in our public sector trying to give impetus to the private sector, that where the insurance company is selling both the government subsidized product and their own commercial product, the commercial products are really growing exponentially compared to the government product. What that shows you is that if the transition or the public education is handled well, we can easily grow the commercial aspect. And that answers strongly the question of sustainability. Two is the source of funding for this. The government has been paying premiums from taxes from the exchequer. But going forward, and in case of a payout, the insurance companies which carry the risk, they pay direct to the beneficiaries. Now, it's a matter of trying to reduce on the government purchase of premiums and growing the voluntary sales. And we also have to take cognizance of the fact that at some point, even the government instruments or even the commercial sales can be overwhelmed. Those have known to escalate to almost half, 50% losses. And at that point, we are levels of catastrophe. We also have to be thinking going forward, as one of the questioners said, going forward, the future of this. That's where the government now has approached the World Bank, and they have developed a development facility, a support facility, in case we go to the catastrophic levels, that the facility can be triggered to come in at the points where the normal insurance systems are overwhelmed. And we have reached those levels at some point, and when an emergency is declared by the head of state, that's when those instruments can be triggered. So it's not a one-off system. It's a chain of players, each playing at their own niche and where they have comparative strength. Here we are at the prevention level, but we know these disasters can get to levels where the normal instruments are overwhelmed, and you need to higher intervention. Even where governments are overwhelmed themselves, you need further intervention, and that's why now the pre-agreed development support comes in, so that we stop diverting development resources to emergencies. You draw that support from an institution, for example, in our case, is World Bank. That CATIDO support is already there, so that that can be thrown in case our systems, our normal systems are overwhelmed. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much there, Richard. I mean, you touched upon so many points, I think, on taking that forward, some of which we haven't much time to. So, for example, what's the role of transferring risk, even which is based upon maybe more inclusive tools, transferring that risk to the capital markets, and where that sort of plays a role overall in the system, if I'm understanding what you're doing together with the World Bank and the facilities that they provide you. And of course the role of government taking that forward over time, which is definitely a challenging one, but I see that you're taking that forward. Now I'd like to pass that finally on to Pranav. Pranav, I'm just going to change the nature of the question, if I may, and ask you the question which somehow within this whole discussion I see as one which is particularly critical, which is the issue of scale. So when I'm looking at the issue of insurance and the development community's role on insurance in countries, which is quite significant in many countries, and there's a lot of pilot work, there's some schemes we're working with some tens of thousands of people and so forth. And countries are also doing the same and piloting new instruments and looking at new instruments. But it does seem to me that it's relatively small scale and particularly targeted to particular areas. Well, that's good and that's important for those people, but what does that mean? What does that mean for the bigger picture? So I'll just give you an example from my own experience. We're working on a GCF proposal for Thailand. It has 62,500 beneficiaries. We're looking to add an insurance component to it. It's all about water management in the Chao Phraya area, which had big floods back in 2011, massive floods. And think, 62,000 people, that's great. But I mean, population of Thailand is a lot more than that, and there's a lot more affected areas. How do we scale up all of this work and actually make it something which is really significant and part and parcel of development? Big ask for you.
No, I can try and answer it in as simple a way as possible. May not be a full answer. But actually, this encompasses the entire issue, I think issues that Coco brought up and our colleague here brought up, on seeing both the demand side of the story, what is the value that is actually being derived by the customers, and on the supply side of the story, that is there a, let me call it, business case for the entire concept to be taken forward? Does 62,500 allow the company to try and innovate and do other things? So I think scale needs to be looked at in a context. And looking at both the demand side and the supply side of the story, I do feel the role for the private sector to play. Whether it is bringing about some level of customer centricity to the entire process, and I believe private sector can play, the private organizations can play a big role in that, in doing need-based analysis, in doing research among customers, in understanding what the cycles of the customers are, if premiums need to be paid, when are premiums available, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this entire issue of customer centricity is important in building a scale on it. The other issue is the government, I mean the private sector can play and has been playing a huge role in what I may call innovation in this entire process. And when I say innovation, I don't mean anything drastic. Well, yes, some of the products that we have been talking about have been developed within the private sector. For example, this entire index-based approach that now has close to 44 million in India and large numbers in other countries. Started in the private sector, and then the government took it up to build on that, but also on processes. And when I say processes, I mean processes related to customer education, processes related to enrollments, processes related also to payouts, and make them in bringing about both time and cost efficiencies. And that is where the entire role for technology and private sector-driven technology comes into play. The other issue is there are mechanisms available for risk transfers to international organizations. So the entire reinsurance market is there. So you have an Africa risk capacity that works with the governments directly on transferring sovereign risk out. You have a CCRIF, which works with 17 Caribbean countries. Coco worked closely with them in the initial stages, so she can talk about that later, on transferring risks out from the sovereign side to bring about this entire issue of sustainability and not tax the government too much on that. So I guess that's another avenue that needs to be applied and worked on accordingly. And thirdly, in our aspect is, as Kamal said, use what is currently available to try and build better synergies between systems that exist. Richard talks about a private company running the similar product and scaling up, whereas the government program's not scaling up. So learning from what is going right there and what is perhaps suboptimal in the program. So these are the issues of kind of facilitating learnings among each other, facilitating learnings between governments and learning from each other in what the pilots have shown, and involving organizations that have already achieved scale in using various mechanisms of technology, in using mechanisms of using grassroots level workers to explain the product, which can actually, see, for example, in India, there are systems, there are farmer-producer organizations that exist and work on all aspects with the farmers, but not on insurance. Can they be engaged? And be prepared for disaster in that sense. There are organizations in, let's say, the Caribbean, so there are communities and credit unions that work with fisheries were mentioned, various others were mentioned, that are fully entrenched there. Can that local social capital be utilized in actually making it a living process in that sense? So I think that's where scale is the movement towards scale that can be indicated.
Thank you very much, Pranav. I think we have finished there. I'm just going to ask for one sentence from the colleagues come back after Pranav on this issue of scale, and maybe I can ask you, Richard, what is, for you, the issue of scale, what's absolutely critical? Just one crisp sentence. Scaling up in Kenya.
The critical part, as far as I'm concerned on scaling up the insurance products, is a refinement on targeting. And there are two aspects, targeting and efficiency in terms of delivery of the product.
Okay.
Those two aspects need to be at the center of scaling up. Because if you don't get them right, the whole thing can come down tumbling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stella, one quick sentence from you on the issue of scaling up.
On scaling up in Uganda, basically the issues are, one, we are looking at other hazards, other disasters, for instance, flooding, landslides. And then for us, the issue is the data that we need to be able to determine at what point we intervene. So for us, data is very important. And then also, as my colleague has said, the method of delivery of the product is also key.
Thank you very much. And you, Kamal, our final point of the panel, to you.
I would say massive awareness raising of consumers is the key, with ambitious government support.
Very good. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to that, and I hope that was some value to you, and I'm sure the panel will take any of your questions up here at the front. Thank you very much.